Karoline West sat with perfect posture on the edge of her leather-backed chair, her tailored navy suit as sharp as the glare in her eyes. The studio lights overhead reflected subtly off her pearl earrings as she tilted her head and offered the smirk that would go viral within hours. Across from her sat Senator John Neely Kennedy, unfazed, steady as a stone under pressure. The panel topic was language and leadership in American politics. When Kennedy finished his statement, an anecdote-rich commentary about American families and the dignity of work, spoken in his trademark Southern drawl, Karoline didn't hesitate. "Well," she said with a soft chuckle, "that's certainly quaint." The room shifted. She continued, voice rich with measured condescension. "Senator, I'm sure your folksy metaphors play well in small-town diners, but in real policy discussions we need clarity, not country slogans." Kennedy blinked once, then twice. He didn't respond with fire. Just a calm, "Sometimes the truth don't need fancy words." The audience chuckled, some nervously, some genuinely. Karoline's smirk deepened. But by the next morning, the internet had chosen its victor, and it wasn't her. Clips of her dismissive tone were spliced with Kennedy's reply, creating a meme storm. "Truth don't need fancy words" was printed on mugs, shirts, even bumper stickers. TikTok teens reenacted the moment. Podcasters debated it. Something had shifted. If this sounds like the start of a battle between pride and perception, don't forget to subscribe and follow the whole story. Karoline had always been brilliant. Raised on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, educated in the halls of Dalton and then Harvard, she could dismantle an argument before most people had formed one. She wasn't cruel, just confident. Fluent in the coded language of academia, policy, and power. At 32, she was already a senior strategist at the Evergreen Group, an elite think tank with deep roots in Washington. She advised governors, lectured on Sundays, and quoted James Madison with ease. Her intellect was her armor, her weapon, her sanctuary. So when her team messaged her the next morning with screenshots of the online backlash, she laughed it off. "They always love a soundbite," she said, tossing her phone aside. "Give it a week." But by the end of that week, something nagged at her. Not the memes, those were expected. Not even the commentary calling her elitist, she'd heard worse. It was something quieter, persistent. Like a shifting wind she couldn't quite name. People weren't just mocking her, they were admiring him. And not in a patronizing way. They were genuinely moved by his words, his tone, his clarity. She watched the clip again, this time alone in her office, the volume low. Kennedy's eyes didn't dart, his voice didn't rise. He spoke plainly, but there was weight behind it. Not polish, conviction. Karoline leaned back in her chair. Maybe it was a fluke, maybe not. A colleague dropped by her office that afternoon. Priya, younger, whip-smart, always reading 10 things at once. "You see Harvard's speaker lineup this year?" she asked casually, tossing a folded program on Karoline's desk. Karoline skimmed the names, sipping her espresso, then paused. John Neely Kennedy, a featured speaker. "Wait," she muttered. "Harvard invited him?" Priya shrugged. "Guess they want range." Karoline stared at the page, silent. For the first time in years, her confidence wavered, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Doubt, not about her intelligence, about what people really needed to hear. The invitation to Harvard wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, signed off by the Dean of Public Discourse himself. Kennedy's name sat alongside other high-profile thinkers and leaders. Karoline reread the list, hoping her eyes had played tricks, but there it was, his plain name in bold black print. She closed the program and stared at the edge of her desk for a long moment. John Neely Kennedy, the man she'd so confidently dismissed, was coming to speak at her alma mater, not as a curiosity or token Southerner, but as a featured voice in a national conversation. It made no sense. That night, she met with former classmates at a rooftop event in Cambridge. Wine flowed, conversations ebbed and surged, and yet the moment Karoline mentioned Kennedy's upcoming speech, the room didn't respond the way she expected. "He's actually kind of refreshing," said Elliot, a tech policy analyst. I mean, yeah, he talks like someone's grandpa, but the man makes you listen. Karoline's brow furrowed. You think Harvard should be giving him a platform? No one said we had to agree with him, Elliot replied. But pretending plain speech has no value? That's the elitism people keep talking about. It hit harder than she expected. Later, back at her apartment, she called Professor Rosenthal. He had taught her rhetoric and argument theory, a mentor who shaped how she dissected public discourse. She trusted him. Why him? She asked, skipping formalities. There was a pause on the other end. Because people trust him, Rosenthal said simply, and trust is a form of intelligence we don't always measure well. Karoline nearly scoffed, but held it in. You're telling me a man who speaks in idioms and bumper sticker quotes is now a model for civic dialogue? I'm telling you he connects, Rosenthal replied. In a time when most people feel talked down to, he speaks eye to eye. That matters. She wanted to argue, to fire back with academic studies, sociolinguistic research, rhetorical frameworks, but the words didn't come. Because beneath her irritation, there was a gnawing sense that maybe Rosenthal was right. Over the next week, she noticed a change in how people spoke about Kennedy. He wasn't just the folksy senator anymore. Articles highlighted his consistency, his grounded values. Even critics begrudgingly admitted he seemed more authentic than most of his peers. Karoline's inbox filled with discussions about civic language, populist rhetoric, and the resurgence of accessible speech in politics. She was invited to appear on another panel, but this time she declined. Something inside her didn't feel settled enough to speak. She spent hours in the Evergreen Group's archives, rereading past essays and memos. Somewhere along the way, she'd started believing that intellect alone earned respect. But Kennedy's rise suggested otherwise. One afternoon, she overheard two junior staffers in the hallway discussing the incident. She's not wrong, but she came off like she thought she was better than him, one said. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, the other added. Karoline stood behind the door, frozen. She had mastered the art of argument, but perhaps forgotten the value of listening. The world didn't want to be impressed. They wanted to be heard. And Kennedy, with all his simplicity, was listening. She didn't regret challenging him. She regretted assuming she was above the need to connect. As the date of Kennedy's Harvard speech drew closer, Karoline faced a choice: stay silent and let the moment pass, or show up and see for herself whether her smirk had blinded her to something real. And deep down, despite the discomfort, she knew the answer. Harvard's auditorium filled earlier than usual. Students, professors, alumni, they came curious, skeptical, some even dismissive. Karoline sat near the back, her seat firm, her eyes steady. She hadn't told anyone she would attend. Part of her didn't know why she was there. John Neely Kennedy stepped onto the stage wearing the same kind of suit he always wore, unfitted, unassuming, no entourage, no prepared script, just a small stack of handwritten notes. He began not with a quote or applause line, but with a story. When I was 15, I took over my uncle's milk route after he hurt his back, he said, his voice even. Had to wake up at 4 a.m., 7 days a week. Not glamorous, but it taught me things no textbook ever could. The room quieted. He didn't speak of politics, not once. Instead, he talked about growing up in Louisiana, about watching neighbors come together after floods, about teachers who changed lives with patience, not credentials. My mama had a saying, he continued. She said, if you're talking so smart, no one understands you. You're not as smart as you think. Took me a while to understand that. Some students chuckled. Karoline didn't. What struck her wasn't the simplicity. It was the weight. He wasn't performing. He was remembering, recounting a life lived with purpose and clarity. He spoke of dignity, of service, of how leaders ought to earn trust, not by grand speeches, but by showing up when it's inconvenient. There's no honor in winning an argument if it means losing your neighbor, he said. We've got enough shouting. What we need is more listening. Silence, then applause, real, resonant, swelling. Karoline stared at the stage, conflicted. The speech lacked complexity, yes, but it had gravity. It wasn't the language of academia, but it spoke to something fundamental, something she'd once valued and somehow drifted from. After the event, she stood hesitantly near the exit. Part of her wanted to slip out. But Kennedy, surrounded by a small crowd, caught her eye and nodded. Not smugly, genuinely. She approached. "Senator," she said, extending a hand. "Miss West," he replied, shaking it gently. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to hear you speak," she said, without interruption. He nodded once. "I appreciate that." There was a brief silence. "You know," he added, "that panel, it helped. Forced me to sharpen a few things." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Being underestimated's not always a curse," he continued. "Sometimes it's fuel." She offered a faint smile, then asked, "And being mocked?" He chuckled. "That too." Another pause. She wasn't sure what else to say. Everything she'd prepared sounded either defensive or contrived. But then he looked at her with the quiet steadiness that marked his speech. "We don't have to talk the same to care the same," he said. "That's what I came to say." Karoline felt something shift, not dramatically, but distinctly. A recognition, not agreement, but understanding. She watched him walk away into the crowd, his presence simple, his message echoing more deeply than she expected. She didn't applaud earlier, but now her hands felt warm, ready, and in her chest a quiet thought stirred. Maybe the real intelligence wasn't just knowing what to say, but when to listen. Karoline didn't speak much on the ride back to her apartment. The streets of Cambridge blurred past her window, but her thoughts were clearer than they'd been in weeks. That single sentence, "We don't have to talk the same to care the same," had looped in her mind like a melody she hadn't realized she knew. The next morning, she opened her laptop and stared at a blank document. For years, she'd been writing policy briefs, strategic memos, commentaries. But now she hesitated. Words had always come easily. That day they didn't, so she closed it. Instead, she reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her cousin Layla in Pittsburgh. Layla had skipped college, taken a job at a medical supply warehouse, and raised 2 boys on her own. Growing up, Karoline had adored her. Then, somewhere between internships and Ivy League summers, they lost touch. Layla's voice on the phone was warm. "Karoline," she said with surprise. "Wow. Long time." "I was just thinking about you," Karoline replied. "I've been meaning to catch up." They talked for 2 hours, about everything. Layla shared stories of layoffs, late-night shifts, navigating school boards. Her words were unpolished, real, piercing. She didn't quote anyone famous, but every sentence carried a truth Karoline hadn't heard in conference rooms. That call shifted something deeper. Over the next few days, Karoline visited local community centers. Quietly, she attended a city council meeting, sat in on a town hall. She listened, not as an expert, but as a student. And what she heard reminded her of something she'd forgotten. Communication isn't just about persuasion, it's about connection. The moment came late one night. She opened her laptop again. This time the words came not as a critique but as a confession. In her op-ed she wrote, "I once believed clarity belonged to the eloquent, that intellect demanded complexity, but last week I listened to someone I once mocked speak truths my education never taught me. Not because he was correct on every point, but because he made people feel heard." And I had forgotten how powerful that is. She didn't name Kennedy directly. She didn't need to. She ended the piece with a question. What if simplicity isn't the enemy of intelligence, but its bridge to the world? She submitted the essay to The Atlantic. Within 48 hours it was live. Within 72 it had sparked a national conversation. Some readers applauded her humility. Others accused her of retreat. But the debate wasn't about her. It was about language, power, and who gets to define smart. Emails flooded in, some from strangers who'd felt dismissed by people like her, others from colleagues who admitted they too had been rethinking how they spoke and who they spoke for. What struck her most was a short note from someone who didn't leave a name. "I'm a first-gen college student. I always felt stupid for not talking like my professors. Your piece made me feel less alone. Thank you. She reread it 3 times. That weekend, she watched a news segment about a bipartisan commission on civic engagement. Kennedy was being considered as a co-chair. In the interview, when asked about public discourse, he smiled and said, "Well, even critics can be honest, and when they are, it helps all of us." No mention of her name, but Karoline knew. And for once, she didn't need credit. She just needed the truth to keep echoing. The invitation arrived with little fanfare, just a crisp envelope bearing the seal of the Kennedy School. Inside, a brief note. "We'd be honored if you would join Senator John Neely Kennedy for a public dialogue on civic communication." Karoline stared at it for a long while. She didn't need to think twice. She said yes. The auditorium was full again, but this time her presence wasn't a surprise. Students whispered. Journalists adjusted their mics. 2 names, once divided by tone and ideology, were now side by side on the same program. The moderator opened with a smile. "Tonight, we bring together 2 voices who've recently reminded us that listening is just as powerful as speaking." Karoline was the first to speak. Calm, measured, but different. Not colder, clearer. "We often treat language as a contest," she began, "but I've learned that understanding can't flourish where pride leads the sentence." Kennedy followed. "I'm no expert on linguistics," he said, eliciting a few laughs, "but I know what it's like to be talked over. And I know what it means when someone starts to listen." The conversation didn't spike with tension. It swelled with substance. They disagreed, yes, but the tone was deliberate, respectful. Karoline challenged Kennedy on specifics. He pressed her on accessibility. They traded ideas, not insults. And through it all, a quiet truth emerged. Change, real change, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in the voices of those willing to revise themselves. By the end, the room was silent, not because it was awkward, but because no one wanted to break what had been built. A student stood to ask the final question. "What would each of you say to your younger selves?" Karoline paused, then smiled. "I'd say, don't confuse fluency with wisdom, and never fear the sentence that humbles you." Kennedy leaned in. "I'd tell mine, son, keep speaking plain, but don't stop listening deep." The audience stood as one. Afterwards, backstage, they exchanged a brief nod. "Well done," he said. "You too," she replied. "Turns out we're not so different." "Just speak different," he said with a grin. They both laughed, genuinely. Weeks later, Karoline sat in the back of a freshman media ethics class as a guest observer. The professor played a clip from the dialogue she and Kennedy had shared. Students took notes. One of them, a girl in a hoodie with chipped nail polish, raised her hand. "It's weird," she said. "At first I thought he was just some old guy using cliches, but then I started to get it. He wasn't simplifying the truth, he was making it reachable." Karoline smiled. That was enough. She stepped outside, the autumn air cool against her skin, and watched the leaves spiral on the sidewalk. No cameras, no applause. Just a quiet moment of peace, earned not through brilliance, but through the choice to change. Her phone buzzed, an email from a high school in rural Iowa requesting a virtual talk on language and humility. She accepted. The arc of her story wasn't about retreat. It was about return, back to what words were meant to do, connect. And in that journey she found what she hadn't known she was missing, not just understanding, but purpose. If you found this journey through pride, perception, and the surprising power of plain speech compelling, make sure to subscribe, and don't miss the next story. We've linked it right here on the screen for you. Because sometimes the words that change the world don't come from a podium, they come from a pause, and the courage to begin again.